A fascinating conversation with Hugh White on the state of play, defence and AUKUS. Hi, for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Allegra Spender. I'm the member for Wentworth, and it is a real honour to be hosting Hugh White this evening on Zoom to be talking about issues which I know are very much in the minds of many Australians and many people in the community. I know the reason why I decided we should hold tonight was because I have many questions that have been raised by members of the community about AUKUS and about our defence environment more broadly, the role that Australia should play. How do we think about defence? How do we think about our relationship with China, with the US, with allies, and how perhaps the walls overseas changed the game. I'm also, share and are on the record with some significant concerns on AUKUS. But what I wanted to do really was give an opportunity for the community to ask questions and hear from one of leading experts on Australia's defence, and make up their own minds, as well as, ask some of those questions that are most important to you. So in a moment, I'll introduce Hugh White, who we're very grateful to have on this podcast, or not podcast, but in this Zoom this evening. But before I introduce Hugh, I'll give you a brief introduction on how tonight is going to work. So I'm going to introduce Hugh, then I'm going to answer Hugh some sort of framing questions, starting with really about the current nature of the Australian the Australian sort of strategic situation. What are the threats to the country? How have these changed over time? And then we will be going specifically into how does AUKUS and other kind of defence postures respond to the environment that we find ourselves in. Some of those questions will be informed by questions that have already been submitted. So thank you everybody who's already submitted questions. And then if there is time, we're trying to wrap up sort of about 10 to 8 if we can. If there is time, I'll try and also cover any questions try to cover off questions in the chat as well. I appreciate there are more questions, to be honest, that we've received than we will have the chance to answer, but we will do our best and also try and cover off any in the chat as well. So if you do have a chance, please pop them in the chat, any Q&A, so that we can see that what is there. Right, I'm going to now introduce Hugh. So Hugh White, AO, is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, focusing on Australian strategic and defence policy, Asia-Pacific security and global strategic affairs. Over his career, he's worked as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, senior advisor to the Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence at the Department of Defence, and the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. He was also the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. He's also the author of several major books on Australian and Asia-Pacific strategy, including The China Choice, 2012, and How to Defend Australia, 2019. And he has a new book that is coming out. When is it coming, Hugh? It's any day now.
Any day now, 24th of August.
24th of August. So you're very lucky, everybody here. You're going to have a chat with someone who's just completed his book but hasn't yet released it. So you can see what you can glean from this conversation. I'm sure that is going to be covered in the book as well. And I've been very grateful to Hugh being incredibly generous with his time and expertise in helping me in building my understanding and around defence and around building that strength of conviction around what, as a country, we need to be doing right now. So firstly, let's talk, I think, as I said in the start, we're going to go from probably particularly the macro to specifically AUKUS. But everything has to, no decision from a defence point of view is taken, out. It should be taken without context. And so that's a place I'd really like to start, Hugh. You've been studying and involved in Australian defence sort of strategy for decades. What is changing? What has changed? And what are the most important concerns as a country we should be considering right now? These are big questions, but let's start with, how's the world changed and what does that mean for Australia?
Well, thanks. Well, first I should say thanks, Allegra. It's a great pleasure to join you on this conversation, and thanks to everyone for listening in. Look, it is a big question, but you're absolutely right. It's always a mistake to start talking about any defence issue without having a clear idea of how we see our situation and what we're trying to achieve in it, and particularly what we're trying to achieve in it with armed force. Now, the big story about Australia today is that for as long as any of us can remember, we have, and I think we've rightly been able to rely on the United States, broadly
Mm,
speaking, to keep Asia stable and
mhm,
Australia safe. And,
mhm,
there's always been a lot of criticism about the US and about the US alliance in some elements of Australian political spectrum, but there's a reason why the alliance has broadly had bipartisan support across the board, and that is because it has basically worked for us, I would say, until now. The big shift today is that America today faces a challenge to its position in Asia, which is more substantial, more demanding, harder to respond to than it's ever faced before. And that's because China is not just for the first time since the late 19th century, a country which is with a bigger economy than America's, and increasingly with armed forces which are comparable with America's in the Western Pacific. But it has a clear ambition to push America out of Asia and to become the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Now, if it succeeds, that would fundamentally change Australia's strategic situation. Now, we might get back later to how bad exactly is that for us, but there's no doubt that it's very different and very unsettling.
mhm,
And so, we do now face, and our political leaders, as they often do, say that we face the most demanding strategic circumstances since the Second World War. I'm not sure they completely understand what they mean by that, but they are right to say it.
mhm, mhm,
A lot of the things that we've taken for granted that Australia would never face a threat from a major Asian power, for example, because no major Asian power could get around the United States. That's simply no longer true. We now have to, I think of ourselves, well, ask to ourselves the question, how do we manage our position? How do we take ourselves forward as a country? And how do we defend ourselves in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us
mhm,
by America? And just to stress how hard and different that is, you could also say that before America kept us safe, Britain kept us safe.
mhm,
So we now face today, for the first time since European settlement in 1788, the question about how the society which immigrants to the continent have built here since 1788 can be defended when Asia is no longer dominated by an English-speaking global great power, and
mhm.
that is the world I think we're now heading into.
Mhm. Now, I guess there's sort of contested views on this. We've seen that, the US have spoken about sort of the sort of pivot back towards the Pacific, and that was certainly, I know, sort of Obama's position, and I know there are many in the US administration who focus on that. Is this just a Trump reaction because he's more isolationist than the US? Has it fundamentally changed, or is this a feature of our current presidency and perhaps where the MAGA movement is going?
Yeah, look, really, really good question. Look, I think there are two parts to that. The first is I do think that Trump is a big deal.
Mm,
It's there is something fundamental has changed in American politics, and the idea that somehow after Trump goes, we'll return to somebody that looks like a combination between a member of the Bush family or a member of the Clinton family or Barack Obama. No, no, no. America's politics has changed, but even if it hadn't, even if Hillary Clinton had been elected for two terms after 2016, even if Joe Biden had been re-elected or we had Kamala Harris, the fact is that what we've seen consistently since Barack Obama came to Canberra in 2011 and declared this pivot, which was the moment where America said, okay, China's challenging us in Asia, we're going to push back. The fact is that America has failed to do it.
mm,
That there's been lots of talk about America's determination to preserve its position as a leading power in East Asia and stand by its allies like Australia. But, if you imagine a graph of Chinese military capability going like that over the last 20 years, and you compare it with America's military capability, which has just gone like that. So whereas there used to be a difference, America was that much superior to China, they're now at best neck and neck.
mm,
Now, an America that was really serious about preserving its position in Asia and maintaining the kind of role that we've depended on it to play in the decades ahead, it would have responded much more seriously.
mm,
And so, even without Donald Trump, I think It is no longer prudent for Australia to continue to depend on America to continue to play the same role in Asia's security and in our defence that we've relied on it to play for so long. Donald Trump just amplifies that
Mm.
because what he tells us, amidst all the other stuff, is that Americans, the American voters, the people who pay the taxes and for that matter put their kids in the uniforms,
Mm.
no longer buy all that old stuff about America being the leader of the free world and being out there to make the world safe for democracy. And
Mm.
actually, this is a different argument. I think, in a sense, they're right not to buy it.
Mm.
Because although I think China's a very formidable country, it doesn't pose the kind of challenge to America at home in the United States, home in the Western Hemisphere, that the Soviet Union threatened to pose, for example. And so, if I was an American, I would be amongst those who said, "We don't have to do this anymore."
Mm.
And so, despite the rhetoric we've seen from some sides of American politics, but not from Trump, I just don't think the evidence supports us in a serious belief that America is willing to do what it takes
Mhm.
to play the
And
role that we used to rely on it to play.
and why did it, just so we understand why you see the different scenarios, why did it before feel that it needed to play
Ah,
such a strong role in the Pacific, and what has changed?
yeah. Look, it's a big subject.
It's a big subject. I know, Hugh. I know you and
Let,
I could spend
let,
evening
let me
doing
let
this.
me give you the 2-minute version of it. Look, America, as Donald Trump likes to say, is an inherently very, very secure country because it's surrounded by two big, beautiful oceans. And,
Mm-hmm.
and it really is for real. And it's by far the strongest country in its own hemisphere. So America is incredibly hard to attack. Uh, and what Americans realized way back in the 19th century was that the only way that America could come under direct threat in its Western Hemisphere was if one country grew so strong by dominating the whole of Eurasia that it could then project power across those oceans and attack America.
Mm.
And during the 19th century, that was never going to happen because it was a balance of power between the countries in Eurasia, primarily the Europeans. In the 20th century, that fell apart, started falling apart in the First World War. Germany threatened to dominate Europe, and if it had dominated Europe, it could have dominated Eurasia.
Mm.
And that's why, in the end, America in 1917 got its act into gear and intervened to prevent the Germans winning the First World War. And they could have won the First World War. I
Mm.
mean, and then
Mm.
the Second World War, the threat was even more serious. What the United States faced was the prospect that Japan on one end of Eurasia and Germany on the other could win their respective regional battles and join in the middle. And you
Mm.
then would have had one coalition dominating the whole of Eurasia. And so there's a reason why twice in 1917 and in 1941, when those two threats loomed, America, you know, abandoned isolationism and really made huge sacrifices to prevent a Eurasian hegemon emerging. And then in 1945, the Soviet Union emerged.
Mm.
By far the most serious challenge. The Soviet Union was in a very good position to dominate the whole of Eurasia and therefore potentially threaten America. And to prevent that happening, the United States decided to contain the Soviet Union,
Mm.
prevent the Soviet Union dominating Eurasia by establishing very strong positions in Europe and Asia. That's what the Cold War was
Mm.
all about. Now, the question today is, does China pose the same kind of threat? Might China end up dominating the whole of Eurasia? Because if it did, then we could rely on the United States to do what it's done in the past to
Mm.
stop it. But the fact is that China, although it's a very strong country and will grow stronger, I think, I mean, it's got lots of problems. Most countries have lots of problems, but it's a very strong country. But I don't think it's going to be able to dominate Eurasia because unlike in the 20th century, where there really only, after the Second World War, two big powers and the rest were also
Mm.
rans. Today we've got China, we've got America, we've got Russia, big story, but I think one of the things we've learned in Ukraine is Russia, for all its foibles, is a formidable power.
Mm.
We've got India,
Mm.
which has come out of, well, it hasn't come out of nowhere. It's always been there, but suddenly India is being recognised as, I mean, it's already got the third biggest
Mm.
economy in the world, have the second biggest economy before the middle of the century. And we've got Europe, which
Mm.
is emerging after, a few millennia of very turbulent history, but thanks partly to Donald Trump and partly to Vladimir Putin, is emerging as a coherent strategic actor in its own right. In
Mm.
other words, we live in a multipolar world. We
Mm.
don't live anymore in a bipolar world. In a
Mm.
multipolar world, America doesn't have to worry that any one of those countries is going to dominate the whole of Eurasia because they'll balance one another out, just like they did in the 19th century.
Mm.
So the isolationism the determination to sit back from Eurasia and let the Eurasians do their thing, safe in its redoubt in the Western Hemisphere, that makes sense again
Mm.
for America. And although very few Americans would mount the argument in the way I've just put it, but one of my principles is look at what people do, not what they say. And when you look at what people do, what America's doing, it is not responding to what's happening in Eurasia in a way that it would respond if it feared the emergence
Mm.
of Eurasian hegemon. And you can tell that by its refusal to really do much to help Ukraine,
Mm.
and not just
Mm.
under Trump. I mean, even under Biden. Biden said even before the invasion that he would not fight World War III to defend Ukraine. Well,
Mm.
that's the difference between this and the Cold War.
Mm.
And I think the same is true. I mean, it's very clear with Trump, but I think it was even clear with the Biden or with Obama that these guys were not prepared to commit the massive resources and take the very big risks that will be required to really
Mm.
respond to China's challenge, because in the end they don't see it as that big a problem for them. It's a
Mm.
big problem for us, not a big
Mm.
problem for them.
Mm. How there've been again, one of the contexts that we're living in at the moment is obviously recent wars and what they have taught us about defense. And we've had the Ukraine-Russia war, and then we've had particularly the Iran America-Israel war that is on, both ongoing. As we think about Australia's sort of defence capabilities, this is a question that came up a lot in the sort of submitted questions. What can we learn from both those two wars about how Australia should think about defence strategy? What have they taught us about what it is to fight a war in this day and age?
Yeah, look, it's obviously a really vital question.
Mm.
I mean, the most obvious thing that we've learned is a lesson at the operational level rather than at the
Mm.
grand strategic level. And a lesson about how wars are fought over relatively short ranges.
Mm.
So, in Ukraine, what we've discovered actually from both sides is that short range drones, to use a, imprecise term, but we know what we mean, uncrewed little vehicles of various sorts, they appear to be able to absolutely dominate a battlefield.
Mm.
Their capacity to surveil makes it impossible for either side to build up the kind of massive concentration of forces that was required for the old
Mm.
style maneuver warfare offensives that, has been the way in which wars have been fought ever since the Second World War, well, really since the end of the First World War. And their capacity to target things expands the zone of lethality from the actual front line back into a wide zone behind it, much more cost effectively than one used to be able to do with artillery or old-fashioned rockets. And that's had a huge impact on land warfare. It's also shown us that whether you're targeting ships, as they're doing in the Gulf, or as Ukraine has done in the Black Sea, or you're targeting land targets at a significant distance, as Ukraine's done so effectively, for example, against Russian oil infrastructure. It's now possible using the technologies that are available to target at relatively long range, I mean 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers, much more cheaply than you used to. And, always want to remember that in the end, war is an engineering problem at one
Mm.
level. It's a moral problem as well. But at the practical level, it's an engineering problem, and how much things cost makes a huge difference. So these are big and significant factors. On the other hand, whether either of those factors fundamentally change the challenge that Australia faces is to me so far less clear. I'm not sure they don't, but it's worth bearing in mind that that the core of Australia's operational challenge, I would say, and we might want to get back to this, but if like me, you think that the primary thing that Australia needs to be able to do with armed forces is to prevent a potentially hostile power from projecting power against us, against our continent,
Mm.
which means because we're an island continent, which means denying air and sea approaches to them, then I think long-range drones are potentially a very valuable additional factor to our way of thinking about how we perform that tasks using uncrewed aircraft,
Mhm.
or perhaps uncrewed seagoing vessels, ships, and maybe submarines. We'll come back to that, I guess. Um, then I think, our capacity to use that rather than other platforms like submarines we're talking about buying from the United States and Britain, that could be a much more cost-effective way of achieving that task.
Hmm.
And I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind as we ask ourselves the question, what kind of forces should we be developing to meet the challenges that we've been talking about?
And so therefore, just as we about to come to AUKUS, so when you say what should be the strategic goal of our defence capabilities, is it that to stop other countries being able to project power onto us through air and sea? Is that how you think about it?
That's how I think about it, but that's not the only way to think about it.
Mm.
And I think one of the really big questions that Australia faces, and including I might say very much in the context of AUKUS, is whether that's the way we think about our defence. That is, how do we Australia by ourselves most cost effectively defend our own continent? The alternative is to ask, how can we, Australia, most significantly contribute to the United States preserving its position as a leading power in East Asia? Because there's no doubt we would be more secure if the United States could preserve its position in East Asia and the Western Pacific.
Mm.
And this is, one might say, an old debate in Australia, really going back to before Federation. Do we depend on allies and build our armed forces to support our allies wherever they might be fighting in the hope that they'll then support us? Or do we defend ourselves and look after ourselves because we can't trust our allies? And we've never, as a country, found a coherent answer to that dilemma because there are strong arguments on both sides. I
Mm.
think today we face, because I said we face a new and unprecedented situation in Asia in the 21st century. I think today the answer is very clear that we should be doing the latter, that is, aim to defend ourselves independently. But if you look at the way in which successive governments, both the coalition government and Labor, they are very ambivalent about this, and there is a strong strand in Australian defence policy today, of which I think AUKUS is a critical part, that says what we should be doing as America faces this very significant challenge from China, we should be doing all we can to support the United States in resisting China's challenge and making sure that America remains the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. If you look at the present government's defence policy documents, for example, they talk a great deal about something they call collective deterrence, by which they mean we in the United States and Japan and others will all gain together to persuade the Chinese to build forces which are so substantial and can cooperate so well together that will persuade the Chinese to back off. Now, I think that's a perfectly respectable kind of strategy to consider. I just don't think it's going to work because of the reasons we've already explored. I don't think America's doing enough to make that work. And therefore, I think it's dumb for Australia to conceive our defence strategy as directed to support the United States in containing China's challenge when I don't think the United States is serious about it. And for that reason, my answer to that traditional Australian dilemma is that we should be focusing everything on building forces which can do whatever we can to deny our air and maritime approaches to potentially hostile power. Now, that's you mentioned before, I published a book a few years ago called How to Defend Australia, a sort of slightly cheeky title. That's what that book was all about. You asked the question, well, can we do that? First question. It's not easy, but I think we can. We have some unexpected, we have some advantages we don't think about enough. We're an island, huge advantage. We're a big island. That's a big advantage. Technology works in our favour, including some of the things we've been talking about as far as drones are concerned. I'd much rather be trying to defend Australia than attack it as long as we make some sensible decisions. And the question then is, well, is AUKUS a sensible decision in that context?
Well, with that, let's come to AUKUS then. Before we jump into the why of AUKUS, do you want to just briefly outline, what you think are the most important pillars of AUKUS?
Right.
There's a big focus on the submarines,
Yeah,
the different categories, but also sort of pillar two.
Look, I think the best way to think of AUKUS is two pillars and an overarching structure. The first pillar is the submarines, and we'll come back to that. The second pillar, which got a lot of discussion when AUKUS was first announced, but which has since sort of faded into the background, was a sort of a declaration of enhanced cooperation with the AUKUS partners, with Britain and America, for research on developing military applications of a range of new technologies, including AI and quantum computing and a few others. Now, there's a lot of talk about that when AUKUS was first announced, but in fact, that seems to have gone nowhere. And I think in the end, that was just a bit of window dressing.
Mm.
That was what was called Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is the submarines, and just in a nutshell, the plan is to replace our existing fleet of 6 Collins-class submarines with, as a first stage, a kind of transitional stage, 2 or 3 American Virginia-class submarines, which would be provided, nuclear-powered submarines, which would be provided by the United States, and then to collaboratively design and build with the UK, but our submarines being built in Australia, what is called the AUKUS class of submarine, which again will be a nuclear-powered submarine. The US submarines are supposedly meant to be delivered in the sort of early mid 2030s, 2033, 2034. The first of the AUKUS submarines built in Australia to a design collaboratively developed with Britain are meant to start arriving in the early 2040s.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the big questions about that are, you know, do we need them and will we get them? But
Mm-hmm.
it's also important to remember that overarching those two pillars was something which is somewhat important than both, and that is that AUKUS for Australia was a declaration that our military approach, our defence policy, would focus on supporting the United States in resisting China's challenge.
Mm. Hugh, I'm having slight troubles hearing you. I'm not quite sure if
and trying to prevent China becoming a leading power.
Okay, I'm losing. Sorry, I'm getting lost the audio and the other, but I'm not sure if that's my connection or your connection. So we'll just see how that goes for a moment.
Okay.
Okay. Right then, in terms of, I guess then coming to the next, let's talk about AUKUS, because as you say, there's a question of will we get the submarines we expect, and then do we want them?
Yeah.
And then, and I know that you're sort of on the record for having a fair degree of skepticism really on both those fronts. But before we get to that, what is if you're thinking in the reasons for AUKUS, what's the justification for AUKUS, that the most powerful justification for AUKUS?
Look, there is a strong argument in favour of nuclear-powered submarines, of us acquiring nuclear-powered submarines to replace the Collins class, because nuclear-powered submarines have a couple of really significant advantages over conventionally powered boats. One is that they don't have batteries they have to charge by running the diesel engines. And so they don't have to, as the submariners call it, snort. They don't have to come close to the surface to stick their exhaust pipe and their air intake above the water in order to run their diesel engines to charge their batteries. And that is one of the moments when submarines are easiest to detect. And obviously the whole thing about a submarine, the reason why you go to all that trouble to put the boat underwater is precisely because it can't be found. And so any aspect of its operations that makes it more vulnerable to detection is something you badly want to avoid. So that's a big advantage. The second big advantage is that they go much faster. Because a diesel electric submarine depends on the amount of charge in the battery, and we all know the faster you go, the quicker the battery goes down. A conventionally powered submarine would normally travel at around 4 or 5 or 6 knots, which is not very fast. It can sprint to maybe 10 knots, but it runs its battery down very quickly then. A nuclear-powered submarine can go at 20 or 30 knots for as long as it likes. And that is a big advantage. And it allows, for example, it means a conventionally powered submarine really can't chase its prey. So it's hunting for a ship, for example, and it can't chase that ship around the ocean. It has to find a place to lie and wait for the ship to come to it. But having said that, conventionally powered submarines are still very powerful tools, and a lot of countries around the world are still building them. The Japanese, the Germans, the Chinese. In fact, the only countries so far that have built nuclear-powered submarines are the ones that have nuclear-powered ballistic missile firing submarines specifically designed for carrying their nuclear deterrent. Now, if you've got that kind of requirement, then you really do need a nuclear-powered submarine, both to protect your nuclear-powered attack submarines, both to protect your ballistic missile-firing submarines, and to attack the other guys.
Mm.
But countries that aren't in that game, that aren't in the business of having a nuclear deterrent at sea with submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and it's what the five big nuclear powers have. If you're not in that game, then no other country in the world has decided to take that step.
Mhm.
The South Koreans are on the threshold of it, but I think that's because the South Koreans are planning to become a nuclear power.
Mhm.
Different case.
Now, so in terms of, let's talk about two challenges with AUKUS. The first question is whether we're going to get the boats. And my understanding is the challenge on the Virginia class submarines is that the US needs to increase its build rate from 1.2 submarines to 2.3 submarines. Otherwise, they're under no obligation to give them to us. Now, the feedback I've been given from defence is to say, well, Australia's making a big investment in terms of being able to help with the maintenance of US submarines, and that will make a big difference in terms of the ability of the US to release submarines to us. And the second challenge has been the second challenge I'm aware of is the House of Commons own inquiry into AUKUS in the UK says it has identified many problems with the UK build of these submarines. Can you tell us your perspective on whether you think we will get the submarines, what the or certainly the timeframe delays, which or are there risks to both programs? How do you think about it?
I do think the chances of us getting any nuclear-powered submarines is very low.
Mm.
And that's because in both the American program and the British program, there are very, very deep problems.
Mm.
It's also worth bearing in mind that we have deep problems here at home in Australia. Our Collins boats are now old boats. In order for Australia to be in a position to start operating nuclear-powered submarines, if they ever arrive, we'll need to have our own submarine capability still up and running, so that we're training submariners to take over these new boats. And the Collins are now in very deep trouble, and the plan to upgrade them to extend their life is looking very shaky indeed. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the American capacity to build enough submarines or to maintain enough submarines in service to be able to spare them to release them to us is really very, very unclear. The government is right, of course. We are putting a lot of money into helping to sustain American shipyards, dockyards, and improve their serviceability rate. But the fact is, it's not working.
Mm.
It's now, 4 years, 3 years since the program was announced through which we were going to buy, meant to be buying the Virginia class, and the submarine production rate in the two US yards that build these submarines has not shifted. It was 1.3 then, it's 1.3 now. It needs to be 2.33. And we're meant to be getting these boats by 2032 or 2033. So, we're already, a third of the way towards that drop deadline, and nothing has happened. So, yeah, we're putting the money in, but we're not getting a result. And I think to imagine that the United States would take submarines out of the US Navy and give them to Australia when it can't meet its own requirements, well, sell them to Australia when it can't meet its own requirements, is fanciful. And as you suggested, you touched on, the fact is that the US legislation specifically requires the president at the point in which the submarines are to be passed to certify that it doesn't undermine US maritime capabilities. He couldn't do that. No US president could do that. And so I think the chances of us getting those submarines is in fact very low. Now, not impossible, but the least you could say is there's a 50% chance we don't get them. I mean, I think that's optimistic, but would anyone bet the future of a major capability like this on a 50% probability? I mean, what kind of project management is that? The other point worth bearing in mind there is that for America itself, building more Virginia-class submarines is not their number one priority. Their number one priority is to build a new class of ballistic missile-firing submarines, and that is eating up all of the spare and emerging new capacity in the US submarine business. And then when we look at the British side of things, it's even worse. I mean, the Americans at least do routinely produce a new submarine new submarine and a bit every year. The British submarine enterprise is in much, much more fragile shape.
Mm.
They too are faced with a need to replace their old ballistic missile firing submarines with new ones. At the same time, they're trying to conclude their old submarine program, the Astute class, and they're trying to bring in this new submarine, the AUKUS class, and complete their first one for them by the late 30s. Now that's extraordinarily fast. They
Mm.
have a very seriously degraded submarine industry because of the cutbacks that followed the end of the Cold War. And as you've said, there are very significant reservations expressed within the within the UK system, in the Parliament and in their kind of independent project
Mm.
assessment bodies, that the UK are going to be able to deliver this. There's also, of course, in the background, a really fundamental problem for the British about the entire shape of their defence budget. I mean,
Mm.
this was one of the things that brought about the departure of Prime Minister Starmer in the last couple of months. So whether Britain is really going to be able to commit to carrying forward the AUKUS submarine project for themselves and for us backing off the back of it is to me very uncertain. And then, of course, there's a question as to whether we can build these submarines in Australia.
Mm.
Building any submarine is an incredibly difficult task, but nuclear-powered submarines are much, much, much more complicated and
Mm.
much more difficult to build. And at a
Mm.
time when the government is also envisaging us with a literally unprecedented program to build surface warships, the
Mm.
idea that we're going to be able to create the industry and build and maintain and operate with all the complexities and safety demands of nuclear propulsion in time to start bringing these boats into service in the early 40s. Well, never say never, but as a prudent piece of project management,
Mm.
the level of risk is astronomical.
Well, I guess the challenge though is that what choices do we have, Hugh, here? Because there are some. I was reading a speech from Peter Khalil, one of the assistant ministers, and his argument was, how else can we protect Australian sea lines? We've seen the damage that can be done, for instance, in the Strait of Hormuz, through people trying to stop the flow of goods. Australia is a trading nation. So therefore, that's why we need these predators, because you can't find them, because they can, project onto other countries. How do you consider that when, to say, well, there are all these drawbacks, but, don't we definitely need them? That's, I guess, the other angle, is to say we definitely need them. So what we need to double down on,
Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
fix this.
yeah,
And I know you don't see the world that way. Do you think
yeah.
it's necessary to protect our sea lines? What, they, as you say, they go faster. In what scenarios are we better off with nuclear submarines versus what scenarios are we better off with alternates?
Look, there are two elements embedded in that very important question. The first is how do we think about defending our sea lines of communication? And that is obviously a big deal for Australia because we're, as you say, absolutely a trading nation. On the other hand, I think we have to be very, prudently realistic about what's involved in that. The real lesson to draw from what's been happening in the Straits of Hormuz in the last few months is how hard it is to protect sea lines of communication. The fact is that all the might of the United States can't keep the Straits of Hormuz open,
Mm.
and submarines don't contribute to that. If if submarines were the capability and need to keep the Straits of Hormuz open, then the Straits of Hormuz would be
Mm.
open.
Mm.
But they're not. More broadly, what we've discovered, looking back from the First World War and the Second World War and the experience we have, is that defending sea lines of communication is an incredibly hard thing to do and gets harder when it's as dispersed as ours is. The British and Americans defended sea lines of communication from the east coast of the United States to Britain in 1942 and 1943 and 1944, but that was a very sort of specific, focused train. I don't think, I often hear government spokesmen saying that, and AUKUS supporters saying that we need these to defend our sea lines of communication. I don't believe submarines contribute to the defence of sea lines of communication. Apart from this, submarines are not defensive weapons; they're offensive weapons. What
Mm.
they do is go out and sink other people's ships, not prevent other people from sinking our ships. And I think, so I think to that extent, the idea that we need them to defend our sea lines of communication just doesn't make operational sense.
Mm.
The other point to make is that in the task that submarines can do, that is to contribute to what we were talking about before as our fundamental military priority, that is to prevent other countries projecting power by sea towards Australia. Submarines can have a very important role to play. But I don't think nuclear-powered submarines, the advantages that nuclear-powered submarines have, those advantages, particularly in speed that I mentioned before, offset the much, much higher cost.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
because, the thing about nuclear-powered submarines is that you pay for that speed with the enormous expense.
Mm.
Now, just to give you an example, a couple of weeks ago, the Canadians announced that they were going to acquire a new fleet of 12 conventionally powered submarines from the Germans, which they are going to spend 100 billion full life cost over the life of those 12 submarines. So what? $8.3 billion per submarine.
Mm.
We are apparently going to get, if we get them at all, we'll get 8 AUKUS submarines for, the government says, 368 billion,
Mm.
46 billion, 5.5 times as much.
Mm.
So if we're serious about spending $368 billion on submarines, we could get 40 conventionally powered submarines.
Mm.
Now, advantageous though it is to be able to travel at speed, we'd be able to threaten and sink more adversary ships with 40 conventional boats than we would with 8 nuclear boats.
Mm.
And it's important always to remember that when we're talking about military things, what counts is not what does one platform do. What counts that is what does the whole fleet achieve.
Mm.
And I think it would be a much more cost-effective way of spending our money, a much more cost-effective way to achieve our strategic objectives, to invest in a bigger fleet of conventional boats that
Mm.
we could acquire much more reliably with much greater risk, that we could operate much more easily without all the complexities of nuclear
Mm.
power, and that we'd have a decent chance of getting delivered. Now, we
Mm.
still would be in a terrible position because we have left this way too late. We should have been launching our new submarines now, not still arguing about what they should be like. But that's the situation
Mm.
we're in, and so I
Mm.
think that would be a much more sensible approach.
Well, going to go to uh, I wanted to go to a couple of the questions we've got in the chat relating to this. One is about more about the thesis of the US is not will not invest in this. The challenge is the US must be worried about their supply chains in Asia, especially the chip manufacturing in Taiwan. Wouldn't that be sufficient for them to care about the region and invest in the defense of the region, because how critical this is in the community to their country?
Well, I think there's a few points to that. The first is, of course, if you ask Donald Trump, then he wants to bring the chip manufacturing, rather than defending Taiwan, he wants to bring the chip manufacturing back to the United States. But more broadly, what I'd say is that America has seen chip manufacturing concentrated in Taiwan over the last few decades. They've seen China's capacity to use armed force to seize Taiwan increase over recent decades. America has done nothing in
Mm.
response to effectively enhance its capacity to defend Taiwan's chip making capability. And so the conclusion one has to draw is, well, the Americans appear to be smart people. They've seen this thing happening. They haven't responded so far. Why should we expect that to change? And
Mm.
I think in the end, the United States, people often say that the United States has to defend Taiwan not so much to keep their own ship supplies flowing, but to keep them out of the hands of the Chinese. I think a more likely way for the United States to do that would be to destroy the Chinese chip fabrication plants rather than to stop them falling into the hands of the Chinese. In fact, I'm not sure the Americans would do that, I think, in the end.
Mm.
I think they just accept that. I mean, an important part of the background to that is it's worth bearing in mind, one of the reasons I'm so doubtful that the United States is serious about maintaining its position in the Western Pacific is because in order to do that, it has to persuade the Chinese it's willing to fight a war over things like Taiwan, and that would almost certainly become a nuclear war. Now, during the
Mm.
Cold War, for the reasons we mentioned earlier, the United States was willing to do that. But if you ask Americans today, sure, you worry about Taiwan. Are you willing to fight a nuclear war with attacks on American cities in order to defend it, the way you were prepared to defend Berlin, for example, in the Cold War? The answer is no. Chips or
Mm.
no chips.
Mm. Then there's another question is, what do you take on the Thucydides, sorry, I don't pronounce it correctly, trap? Even if the US doesn't want or have the capacity to challenge China in our region, is a clash inevitable?
Yeah, well, uh, uh, it's a really good way to frame the question because, what the Thucydides trap is all about is, what Thucydides said in 5th century Athens is that when a rising power starts to challenge an established power, they always go to war. And there's a lot of examples of that being true,
Mm,
but it's not inevitable because the way over history rising powers have avoided going to war with established powers or vice versa is when the established power makes way for the rising power,
mm,
as Britain made way for America as a rising power
mm,
in the 19th century. And the reason why we've avoided war so far is that in the end, America's making way.
mm,
Now, I do take the risk of a US-China war quite seriously, but I don't believe it's inevitable because I
mm,
think, in fact, what's happening is the United States is withdrawing. The
mm,
fact that, my little graph in the air of China's military capability going like that and America's military capability going like that, that's what the historians will look back at and say, oh, okay, well, the Americans looked at it and they decided in the end we're not prepared to pay the cost and risk
mhm,
of resisting China's challenge in order to preserve our position in the Western Pacific. So we'll step back. Now, no one in America wants to, no one in Washington, no one in the US foreign policy establishment wants to stand up and say that. Though Donald Trump's happy enough
mm,
to do it. But no, none of the old guard want to say that, but that's what they're doing.
mm,
And so I think, the good news is we're probably going to avoid a US-China war in Asia. The bad news is that'll happen because America's given it up.
mm. And that comes, I'm going to then so pivot to the kind of final questions really, which is, so what do we do? So your view is obviously that the ships are not going to come, nor did we actually want them in the first place. The US is disengaging effectively at some level from the Pacific. What does that mean for how we defend? Yeah, and so then the question is like, well, what should we be worrying about? Does Australia just say, look, no one's going to bother about us? So, there are a range of options which go from no one's going to bother about us, so, maintain a little defence force, but don't take it too seriously, to, we do have threats we don't know, versus, we need to try and change the course of what the US is doing. Like, or, do we exit AUKUS? Can we exit AUKUS? There's all right. I haven't framed this question very well, Hugh, but the question is, so now what? In your mind, so now what?
That's exactly the right way to frame it. Look, okay, let's look at it at a couple of levels. The first is, what are we trying to achieve strategically? The working hypothesis in Canberra has been that we cannot survive and flourish in an Asia which is no longer dominated by the United States. So we have to do whatever we have to do, including, if necessary, support the United States in going to war with China
Mm,
in order to preserve American leadership in the Western Pacific. Now, I don't think that's going to work because I
mm,
don't think the Americans are up for it. I also think, although I'm not for a moment Pollyanna-ish about the guys in Zhongnanhai and the way they see Chinese power in the region. But I don't buy the argument that Australia can't make its way in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by white guys.
mhm,
I think Australia can and should start focusing on what it's going to mean for us to live in an Asia which is, so to speak, run by Asians. And,
mm,
I think this is what Bob Hawke and Paul Keating had in mind when 35 years ago they were talking about looking for our security not from Asia but in
mm,
Asia. And
mm,
so I think that mindset is a very important thing to
mm,
change to start with. And in a sense, that's just part of the whole great, sort of centuries-long drama of Australia coming to terms with where it lives, and it's
mm,
an old story, but it's not over yet. So that's the first point. The second point is that we need to get a steer on, what would that mean to us in terms of, the kind of threats we might face. I'm not one of those who thinks that China threatens Australia today.
But
When, for,
it's
when
trying to intimidate us as it is. I mean, it's in
Oh,
terms of its
well,
actions,
well, but
don't you think?
there's a difference between great powers, and China's a great power, and
Mm,
it acts like a great power, and great powers are bullies.
mm,
All great powers are bullies.
mm,
America's a bully.
mm,
Britain, when it was a great power, was a bully. France, when it
mm,
was a great power, was a bully. That Russia is a bully.
mm,
China is a bully. That's what India is, a bully to its own neighbours. You know, that's something we're going to have to live with.
mm,
But there's a difference between being a bully and being an enemy.
mm,
And I don't think China threatens Australia today. So when they sail their Navy task groups around Australia and so on, that doesn't pose a direct military threat to our security. It does inform us that they could do so in future, but we don't need that to inform us of that. We can just see the developments of China's military capability. So, it's an exaggeration and a mistake to think that China threatens us militarily today, but I do think we need to recognize that the potential for China to threaten us militarily in future is going to be much greater than it has been in the past. In the past, when America's been the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, clearly had the capacity to resist any Chinese power projection and clearly had an interest in doing so on behalf of Australia, which all I think has been true in the past. That's not going to be true in future. So we as a country have to ask ourselves, well, how likely is it that our relationship with China will develop in a way in which China might decide it does want to
mm,
pose a threat to us? Now, it's a bit hard. I do find it hard. I've spent my whole life, as you said at the beginning, thinking about this stuff. I still find it hard to conjure situations in which China might actually decide that it made sense for them to use armed force against us. But I do just note that great powers do have a habit of doing that. All great powers do have a habit of doing it. So we have to make some decisions in our future about how far we develop the capacity to raise the costs and risks to China of using armed force against us to the point that they should decide against it on the one hand, and the point that we are prepared to accommodate China's wishes and bend to its pressure in order to avoid that happening. Now, the judgment I made was that Australia, if we really played our cards right, could build and maintain forces that could raise the costs and risks to China of projecting power against Australia to the point that it wasn't worth their while for something like 3 or 4% of GDP, which is, of course, a lot more than we've been spending in recent decades. But it is what we spent during the Cold War, or at least during the first decades of the Cold War,
mm,
during the 50s and 60s. So that's not an unthinkable thing for Australia to do.
mm,
But we'd have to spend that money very, very wisely, and we wouldn't want to be spending 368 billion bucks of it
mm.
on nuclear-powered submarines that we don't know and we're not going to get. We'd need to be much shrewder than that.
But how do we get out of this? Even if you wanted, like, there are many people who don't want to get out of AUKUS, but even if you did, the US has just said, yep, doubling down, we're going to head ahead with it, so do we say to the US, who is still, a close ally of ours under Andis and others, that, hey, we're out? Is that worth doing?
There are a lot of smart people in Washington, D.C., and the smart people in Washington, D.C. understands that AUKUS is a big mistake for America as well as for Australia. It
Mm,
makes no sense for them to sell the submarines to us.
mm,
And, the guys in Washington who promoted AUKUS weren't serious about submarines and weren't serious about Australia's capability. They just wanted a symbolic way to look like they were doing something big in Asia without spending any money, or rather by spending our money. So I think the smart people in the Pentagon, the smart people in the US Navy, and for that matter, the smart people in the White House, if there are any, would say, great, no, that's good. We're off this hook. In Britain, of course, they'd moan and gnash their teeth because let's be under no illusions. From Britain's point of view, AUKUS is all about us helping to pay for their new submarines.
mm.
And that would be a disappointment. But frankly, we don't owe the British anything strategically.
But the US has just had this review of AUKUS, which has been endorsed. So why have they done that, do you think? And so
Well,
that's my last question. I know we're over time, but these
well,
are
well,
important questions.
well, the Pentagon ran a review of AUKUS, which one is reliably informed was very negative about it. And then they were told that Donald Trump wanted to say that he supported it, so they rewrote the review.
Mm,
But the review still had some very serious conditions that were placed on AUKUS, which
hmm
the government neither our government nor the US government has ever acknowledged. I think the reservations
hmm
amongst the serious strategic players in the Pentagon and in the US Navy, the reservations about AUKUS still run very deep.
mm,
Now, Trump chose for his own reasons to say that AUKUS should be going full steam ahead when he had the lunch with Albanese last year. But really, support for AUKUS in Washington hangs by a single thread, and that thread is Donald Trump,
Mm.
his smile.
Mm-hmm.
And Donald Trump can change his mind, as we see every day,
Mm-hmm.
in a heartbeat.
Mm.
I don't think there'd be any serious consequences for Australia and for our alliance with the United States in walking away from AUKUS, because the sensible people in Washington don't want a bar of it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Hugh. It is wonderful. We've gone over time. It's been a really great discussion, and I know a very provocative one as well. But these are questions that are being asked very seriously, and it's certainly been an area where we haven't had a public debate about AUKUS. We had a very fast major party stitch up, and where the only sort of really public debate now is happening is through academics like yourself, and also through now this independent inquiry set up with Peter Garrett, but also Chris Barry, the former head of the ADF. Is also one of the key people in that, and I think it is important. I just was reading Gareth Evans' evidence. He's also a skeptic, which is interesting. And there are a number of you, and very well qualified. It's quite a well qualified group, I have to say. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody who joined online on a Tuesday night. Thank you for all your contributions and your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I hope we have managed to really sort of at least answer some of your questions and give you a chance and a privilege to listen to Hugh on these questions. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay. Thanks, Hugh. And see you in a couple of weeks with the new book. Can't wait.
Well, thank you.
Looking forward to it.
I hope that worked well. I really enjoyed it.
No, well, I enjoyed it too. We've had lots of people on, and so people really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Fantastic. Okay, well, see you in a couple of weeks' time.
See you in a couple of weeks. Good luck for the next few weeks. Take care. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to your team too.
I will. I'll pass it on. Thanks.